Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. We have been marinating in Enneagram content.
Marinating.
Yeah, we've just been completely soaking it up because we have, for basically a year, been putting together these Enneagram starter kits, which are companion pieces to the Myers-Briggs starter kits. And as we talked about in, I think it was just the previous episode with Christian Rivera, who discovered while he was working with us that he had his Enneagram type, well, he had been mistyped. And so we've been basically just sort of in this world of talking about the Enneagram and discussing it and discovering new aspects of it and ourselves.
Yeah.
And we're about to launch into a 3-part series with our partners, Dr. Beatrice Chestnut and Antonia, who are the teachers of the Enneagram experts, particularly as it is applied to subtypes, which take the 9 Enneagram types and then split them into 27, including what's called instincts. So they are brilliant. They're geniuses. We love them, and we partner with them as much as we can. And we're about to launch into a 3-part podcast series with them, talking about different centers of intelligence. But before we do that, we thought that we would present to you a talk that Dr. Beatrice Chestnut gave on the main stage of our Profiler training event, basically introducing students that were there for Myers-Briggs content to the Enneagram. And what's cool is that Beatrice herself was a student that week and was learning about Myers-Briggs cognitive functions in a way that she had never really heard of before. So as as she gave this talk, she was making connections herself around Enneagram types and cognitive functions. And I wouldn't say all of them were entirely accurate. She was just spotting patterns. And even she herself in the talk mentions, and she's like, oh, I'm kind of seeing this pattern of this cognitive function and this Enneagram type. So don't take anything in this talk as like doctrine. But what's nice about the ever-developing relationship that we have with Beatrice and Antonia is we're starting to see all of these patterns emerge, patterns around Enneagram types and Myers-Briggs cognitive functions, and things are just getting sort of more and more clear over time. But that said, before we launch into this 3-part series that's coming up in a little bit of the different centers of intelligence, we wanted to present this talk so that you can get the basics of the Enneagram, just in case you're new to it, in case you're a Myers-Briggs enthusiast. And I think even for myself, as somebody who is very familiar with the Enneagram at this point, I pulled a lot of great information out of this talk as well. So it's not just for beginners, not just for people who need an introduction. It's also for people who are already familiar with the Enneagram. But if you are new, we want to make sure that you have a strong basis. So this talk goes into the centers of intelligence. It also goes into what those instincts are, the different elements that give a lot more texture to an understanding of your Enneagram type.
A couple quick edit notes. Obviously, I took this raw audio that we recorded there, and I cut out the question and answer section afterward because it would just go on too long and you couldn't hear people in the audience. So this is another reason to sign up for Profiler training in the future, because you get cool talks and then you get to talk to the person that was there. But so I took those out, but I did leave a few questions in. I just compressed it. So you'll see Beatrice just restate the question and then answer it, because some of the questions were really powerful. Like how do you find your Enneagram type, for example? And then we'll see you at the end of this talk. So without further ado, let's go right now to the main stage at our Profiler training event in Orlando, Florida, and hear about the Enneagram from Dr. Beatrice Chestnut.
Thank you. So I just want to give you kind of an overview of the Enneagram and then take your questions, because I don't want to speak too much to things you don't want to know, and I want to speak to things you do want to know. This is the Enneagram, in case you haven't seen it. I almost never do this without PowerPoint. These guys, I'm like thinking to myself, like, I got to get rid of my PowerPoint. These guys, I like the way they do it. I might even pass this around because some of you might have not seen the symbol. So this is an Enneagram. It's a 9-pointed star inscribed in a circle. The symbol itself is very powerful and potent. It's ancient. It has been called by one of the sources of what we know about it a symbol of perpetual motion. The Philosopher's Stone of the Alchemists. Gurdjieff, who's he's too long a story to tell you who he is, but he's one of the sources of sort of the more esoteric information about the symbol. He said, if you know how to read the Enneagram, and almost nobody does, it makes books and libraries entirely unnecessary. Everything, it's a symbol of all and everything. You can read everything in it. And it's 3 parts. It's a circle, an inner triangle, and a hexad. And it brings together the law of 1, the idea that everything is connected, the law of 3, the law of creation, the idea that it takes 3 forces to bring any process or anything into existence. And like if you think about the Newtonian world, like force and counterforce, or the polarities that we talk about in the Jungian functions, Jung's idea was we get in complexes, and there are these kind of like polarities, and what do? We be with the polarities until a third force comes. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So that's kind of fundamental to this, and then the law of 7 is a law of sequence, like the musical scale. And when you bring these 3 things together, you get this very powerful symbol of perpetual motion. So the Enneagram is a process map, and it needs to be seen as in motion, which is why these arrow lines are here, and those arrow lines are very important. So that's just to give you a sense of what this model is based on, this symbol. That's the basis of the framework. But now I'll talk more about the typology. So many of you probably know it's a system of 9 types. And whereas the Myers-Briggs is more like 2s and 4s, there's a threefoldness to everything in the Enneagram. So that's part of the challenge. I'm over there thinking, well, how are we going to bring these things together? Because you've got 4 and you've got 3. And that's one of the challenges. There are 16 Myers-Briggs types, there's 9, and then 27 Enneagram types. But interestingly, there's a lot of overlaps, especially in terms of how we use it for growth. But just to give you an overview, there are 9 types in the Enneagram system, but they're grouped in groups of 3 groups of 3. And it's based on the idea that we have 3 centers of intelligence. Our head that thinks and analyzes and plans, kind of like what we heard in some of the thinking functions. Our heart, that's also a center of intelligence, co-equal to the head. So here it's a little bit different in that, in Myers-Briggs, there's a cognitive function of perceiving or judging, but that's drawing on data from the heart or from the emotions or from other people's emotions. But with the Enneagram, it's like, no, you're more based in the heart if you're a heart type. So there are 3 types that overuse the head center, 3 types that overuse the heart center, and 3 types that overuse the body center. So we all have all 3 centers, and they're all kind of talking to each other all the time as we go through life. But there are types 5, 6, and 7 in the Enneagram overuse the head center, so they're head-based. So when you find your Myers-Briggs type, you're likely to have like TI or TE in there. It's not that simple, of course. Also, N is kind of heady in a certain kind of way. But the head is about analysis, planning, thinking into the future, anticipating what's going to happen. The heart type is about emotions and relationship, a lot of focus on relationship and connecting to other people through feelings and empathy, sensing how other people feel or being inside of how you feel. And then the body center is also a co-equal center of intelligence, a little bit like SE. When I'm hearing SE, I'm like, that's the body type. So the body types would probably have SE in there somewhere, maybe sometimes SI in a certain way. And again, it gets complicated when we try to talk about the correlations, but the body center is the center of kinesthetic intelligence, instinctual intelligence, gut knowing, moving into action or getting stuck in inaction. That's a polarity, and there's a lot of polarities within the Enneagram as well. But we have these 3 centers, and the idea is, again, each type overuses one center. So it's a little bit like this. I'm a heart type, I'm a 2. And sometimes when I think I'm thinking, I'm actually thinking with my feelings, right? So I might be thinking about my friend, and I'm actually mad at my friend. And so I'm thinking kind of negative thoughts about my friend, and I can think, oh, I'm being objective, and there's just something wrong with her, right? But actually, my feelings are coloring my thinking. Right, and so that's something that what happens in the idea behind the Enneagram types is we're out of balance in that we overuse that center and we sometimes steal energy from the other centers, or we do a job that is better tailored to that center with a different center. So Like analyzing something objectively needs to be done by the head center. If I do that with my heart and I don't realize it, I'm not going to be very objective, right? So sometimes when I'm upset and I have to write an email to someone, I write it and I have to wait another day because I know I can't send it right away because I'm too colored with my emotions. And then if I still feel like it's not good enough, I send it to my head type friend and I say, can you edit this and take out all the emotion? And so she looks at it, she goes, you're taking that too personally. It's just business, it's not personal, you gotta take that out. I think you could say that differently, boom, right? Where I can't see it because I'm coming more from my emotions. And similar with the body type center and similar with the head center. So sometimes head types can think they're feeling when they're actually thinking about feelings, right? Sometimes heart types can think they're having a sensation when they're actually, it's colored with feeling, where body types are all about sensing and sensory data and experience, right? 8s, 9s, and 1s are body types. And so I have a good friend who's a 9, and 9s have a hard time making decisions. And he says what will help him make a decision is if he can actually experience one of the choices. Like, should I do this or should I do this? Well, I'll go try and experiment with actually doing that, and I don't like that. I'll do this other thing, right? So it's a little bit like that these 3 ways of functioning are a little bit more separated out. And the intelligence I think we know the least about these days is instinctual intelligence. Like we all know about IQ and head intelligence. Since Dan Goleman and the emotional intelligence stuff, we know more about emotional intelligence. But there's also this body-based intelligence that's part of this. And we have neural cells in our heart and our gut. They've kind of realized that lately. So we now recognize that these really are, it's kind of like we have 3 brains. And Claudio Naranjo, who's one of the seminal Enneagram sort of pioneers, authors, teachers, he used to say, we're 3-brained beings. And they're co-equal, and it's important to use all 3. Now, in the West, our education system teaches to the head. So there's a kind of priority given to the head. And sometimes this is why you have body type kids who don't fit in school because that's not their intelligence center. And so they're having to sit and do equations or do things that are head-based, and then they get really squirmy, and then they say, you've got ADHD, we've got to medicate you. And there have been people in the Enneagram world who have written about that, how we need to understand instinctual intelligence more. So in addition to these 3 different ways of functioning with the 3 centers, each of these 3 centers is associated with one of the 3 core emotions of the human ego. Fear, sadness, and anger. So we call the body-based types anger types. Now, it doesn't mean they're all walking around being angry all the time. Quite the contrary. It depends on it's more that part of the way your personality is shaped is based on your relationship to that emotion. Now, in each center, there's one type that overdoes the core emotion, that almost lives in it too much, one type that underdoes the core emotion, that isn't very in touch with it at all, and one type that's kind of in the middle, that's sort of in conflict with it. So in the body center, 8s overdo anger. They live in it more. And from the Enneagram standpoint, I really want to emphasize that there's no good or bad, right or wrong about these emotions. They just are. And sometimes we bring our ideas about what's good or bad to do. And so it's important to kind of recognize that there is no one type that is better or worse than the other, just like in Myers-Briggs. And if you notice, that's a fear type, I don't want to be afraid, that you're bringing that to the table, because in this scheme, none of this is thought of as a bad thing. It's more like there's an upside and a downside to every aspect of this. And a lot of the way the Enneagram types function in practice is unconsciously. So this is sort of a wired-in unconscious type. Similar to Myers-Briggs, we think that it's with us from birth. So 8s overdo anger, 9s underdo anger. We say 9s go to sleep to their anger, and 1s are kind of in conflict with it. Now, the important thing to know is when we're not consciously aware of a feeling, it doesn't go away, it leaks out in passive forms, right? So 8s, one of the nice things about 8s is they're in touch with their anger, they'll express it, and then it's done. right? And so 8s are one of the types that's sort of more okay with conflict, for instance, because it's like, sometimes 8s will even say, I don't trust someone until I've had a conflict with them, because it lets me know where you stand. And the body types are a little bit about coming up against somebody and sort of finding a sense of almost physical separation by coming up against people energetically. Now 9s go to sleep to their anger, and it leaks out as passive aggressiveness or stubbornness, and so very passive forms of anger. Like if you tell me to do something and I don't like the way you told me, I'll say, oh yeah, I'll do that. You know, because 9s are all about harmony. And they're all about everybody getting along and being connected to people and meeting needs out there. You know, it's a lot of the FE. And yet, at the same time, they don't allow themselves to feel anger, and yet that's in there, right? Because the main coping strategy is avoiding discomfort, avoiding separation, and conflict feels like it will lead to separation. And so they avoid conflict a lot, and so they're very friendly and easygoing and adaptable, but they're anger types, and part of the healthy development of the 9 is getting in touch with anger and learning to express it more directly and learning that anger is connected to power. Then 1s are in conflict with it. 1s are sometimes called the perfectionist or the reformer. 9s are called the mediator or the peacemaker. I don't use the names in my book, but it's nice sometimes to have the names when you're just learning it. 8s are sometimes called the boss or the challenger. And 1s are in conflict with their anger because 1's main coping strategy is to be good or to be right, to get it right. They're always trying to improve things and make things better. And so they're really looking at how can I make whatever is happening more perfect or better somehow. So they are at odds with their anger, and so it leaks out more as irritation, frustration, resentment, and part of 1's resentment and irritation comes from the fact that they're always trying to do the right thing. They follow the rules, they're trying to be good people, and they're looking around and going, why isn't everyone else following the rules? And that makes them frustrated, right? Because I'm working really hard to do it right and they aren't. So then 2s, 3s, and 4s are heart-based types. And by the way, 8s focus, a lot of what the Enneagram is about is where your attention goes. So it's what do you pay attention to? And 8s pay attention to power and control and strength. They often have the sense that the world is divided into the strong and the weak. And so they want to express their strength, and they tend to deny their vulnerability. And by the way, every type has a focus of attention, but also blind spots. When you focus on some things, there are some things that aren't in your field of vision that you don't really pay attention to. And a little bit like exactly what Antonia said earlier today, there's a way that each type kind of has strengths and specialties, and then they double down on those ways of doing things, and they kind of do things over and over again that way because that's what they're good at and that's the way they see things. But it's like seeing 360 degrees of reality through a narrow slice. So a big part of the Enneagram is recognizing, okay, what's my field of vision? What do I tend to look at? And what do I tend to do because I've become really good at it? But I'm overdoing my strengths, and to the extent that I overdo that, they become liabilities because I'm overdoing a particular set of strengths and not developing a wider range of strategies. So the 2s, 3s, and 4s are heart-based types. And their core emotion is sadness. And this comes from a sense that they usually got some sort of message in childhood. And these types are based on coping strategies that start in childhood. But of course, the coping strategy you use is probably wired in. We believe it's like temperament, you're born with it. And they usually got the message, the heart types, that they weren't loved for who they essentially are, but for what they do, or what they do for other people. So they each, 2s, 3s, and 4s, each kind of develop a strategy based on how to get the love that they feel like they don't get just naturally. So 2s decide, I'm going to help others, support others, be pleasing to others, help others have a positive experience, and then they'll do the same thing for me. So 2s don't express needs very much, but they meet other people's needs, and then they have this, we heard this week, this idea of reciprocity. There's this exchange mentality that if I do this for you, when I need something, you'll do it for me without me having to ask. Because 2s don't like to ask because they don't like rejection. And so asking for what you need feels like asking to be rejected. And so 2s kind of go to sleep to their needs. It's a real blind spot. But then they meet others' needs thinking, well, if I'm do this for you, then you'll automatically do it for me. And then, of course, they get resentful and exhausted when they're doing a lot for others, but they don't get back what they're expecting, because not everybody's 2s. And one of the great things about the Enneagram and Myers-Briggs is you learn not everyone sees the world the way you do. So 3s, sometimes called the performer, they have a strategy of, I'm going to be successful or efficient and productive, and they're very results-oriented. And they are types that are very active, and they actually are really good at being successful because they're very task-oriented, very work-oriented, very goal-oriented. It's as if they can pick any goal, and then they focus on it like a laser beam and make it happen, right? Very task-oriented. But they're really good at focusing. But the problem is they also are very focused on and having that image of success and what things look like, and they're chameleons or shapeshifters. And 2s are shapeshifters also. It's like, what do you want me to be? And that's what I'll turn myself into. Now again, very unconscious usually. But because they can shift in every context to be whatever's required and whatever's viewed as successful, they lose touch with who they really are. So both 2s and 3s, part of the growth path is, who am I really? And for 3s are almost so all of us do this, right? All of us identify with a persona or personality, and we lose touch with our deeper capacities because we spend a lot of energy kind of doing what's expected or doing what works. So there's a way that 3s need to really get in touch with, who am I really? And one of the ways 3s do that is getting more in touch with their feelings. Because it's a little bit like, I heard a lot of 3 in TE. It's a little bit like, I'm very work focused, I make things happen, but sometimes what I want or who I really am or what's important to me gets lost in the picture of that. It's like I'm whoever I need to be to make it happen or make you think I'm looking good. And so it's a big growth moment for 3s when they realize, oh my gosh, I don't even know who I am. And I reference the outside to know who I am. And by the way, 3 of the Enneagram types are other referencing, 3 are self-referencing. You know, like we talked about FI being very internal referencing, and 3 of the types kind of go back and forth. So then 4s are types that don't shapeshift, unlike 2s and 3s. They're heart types, very focused on relationship, but they're much more focused on their inner world. But their strategy for connection and getting the love they didn't get often early on is, I'm going to be special. I'm going to be unique. Nobody's like me, right? And when I would say the biggest correspondence between one of the judging functions or perceiving functions that I heard in the Enneagram type is FI. FI sounds a lot like 4. Like everything on that list could be said about 4. And some of the others are close, but some of the other ones are more mixed. Like there's 3 or 4 types that probably could be, high in that function. So 4s very much live in an internal world of emotion, the most emotional of all 9 types, self-referencing, but very much in a kind of sense of wanting to be understood. It's all about being understood and having connections through mutual understanding. So then 5, 6, and 7, 5 are head types associated with the core emotion of fear. 6s overdo fear, 7s underdo fear, and 5s are kind of in the middle. 5s get good at avoiding situations in which they would feel fearful. And so 5s are probably the most introverted of all the types in the Enneagram, and they are types that live a lot in their head. And it's very much, my business partner is, I think he's an ENTP, really high in TI, and has a lot of everything on that list of TI, and very much of a thinker, someone who's kind of needs to go away to process things. Like if he and I have a meeting, he needs to go away and process it before he can tell me fully what he thinks. Fives push away feelings a lot. They can feel easily overwhelmed by emotions, especially other people's emotions. And they live very much in their heads, and they feel much more comfortable in the mental processing mode. Are also very concerned about having enough time and space and boundaries. They have this sense of scarcity around energy and time and space, as if I need to be really careful about my energetic resources, and that's why they can avoid people who are too emotional, because it's as if they have like an internal gas tank of energy, and throughout the day they're very aware of the gas going down. And if they have an emotional interaction with someone where they have to deal with someone else's feelings, it's like, whoop, the gas just went way down, because that takes a lot of energy and it feels overwhelming. Sixes are the core fear type. And so they are scanning for threats and dangers and risks, good problem solvers, good troubleshooters. They're always anticipating what could go wrong so that they can prepare for it. Sometimes they get perceived as negative or pessimistic because they're always looking for what could go wrong, because they don't want to be caught unaware in case the worst happens. They think in terms of worst case scenarios. But good, very insightful. They tend to be very intuitive because they get really good at predicting what's going to happen, and sometimes they just have that inner sense of what's going to happen. But sometimes also they project their fears out onto the world, and they can be paranoid, or they can think, okay, that person has it out for me, when really it's their own fear that they're projecting out there and then seeing it as originating out there. But fear, it's like a fearful person wants something to attach their fear to so they can take action to do something about it. But sixes can sometimes have trouble going into action because of the fearfulness. Now sevens, and I want to quickly do this so I can talk a little bit about that, and I know I'm running out of time. This is what I said, I didn't have time to do a short talk. Sevens are also a fear type. However, they often don't relate to feeling fearful because they tend to focus on what's positive. They see possibilities, very NE, I would say, but also maybe NI too. It can go either way, and there are other moving parts in the Enneagram, just like with the Myers-Briggs, which kind of determines how things play out. But sevens focus a lot on the positive, on feeling good, on keeping the mood up, on whatever makes them feel happy and other people happy. And what tends to be unconscious in them is that they're doing that as a way to get away from whatever is painful, uncomfortable, anxiety-provoking, anything like that. It's like their motto might be something like, why would you feel bad if you could feel good? And for sevens, it feels like a choice, right? For fours, it's like, hey, if like you're thinking, if you feel something and you're legitimately feeling it, that's just authentic. There's nothing wrong or bad about having a certain feeling. All the feelings aren't bad or good, they just are. They're valid as long as you have them. And so for a four, this is a way a four can be a little bit opposite to a seven. It's like there's nothing wrong with feeling sad, and they can even enjoy feeling sad. Whereas for sevens, it's like, oh yes, there's something wrong with feeling sad. Like, why would you feel that? Like feeling pain or sadness, like, bleh, why, what's the purpose of that, you know? But it's this unconscious fear of suffering. So we often say that fives have fear of feelings, sixes have fear of being, and sevens have fear of suffering. So sevens have this underlying fear that sometimes they're not always conscious of, that if they allow themselves to get in touch with pain and suffering, they'll be trapped in it forever. So they tend to be really fast-paced. They think really quickly, and their mind moves from different thing to different thing very quickly. Sometimes we say they have monkey mind. They're people that are always seeing the silver lining. They're always telling people to look at the bright side. They can reframe a negative into a positive like that. And part of that is motivated by a sense of anxiety that sometimes they don't register as anxiety, of like, I don't want to get trapped in an uncomfortable feeling. I don't want to be forced into an uncomfortable feeling by somebody else. I don't want to go there because, again, it's like if I open up that door, I won't be able to close it again. And so because of that, they can be relentlessly positive and optimistic, very enthusiastic about things, and sometimes that's a positive. Like, as I say these things, you can hear, like, a lot of these things have their positive points. And yet there's always a downside. And so part of it is balancing, becoming more aware and conscious so that you can leverage your strengths, but also not get stuck in sort of the blind spot or the unconscious pattern that is underlying a lot of this.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show.
Now I want to say a couple of things about the instincts and the subtypes, and then I want to find out if you have any questions. So there are these 9 types, but they break down once more into 3. So there are 3 1s and 3 2s and 3 3s. There are 3 kinds, 3 versions of each of the 9 types. Now this is really important element to know about the system, because it's actually hard to find your type correctly when you're just looking at the 9, because there are these 3 more nuanced versions of each type that give you a lot more information and specificity about the 3 varieties, like the 3 flavors that each type comes in. And if you don't know that, there are some of the subtypes. So for each of the 9 types, you have 3, giving 27. There are some of the subtypes that really you won't have ever heard of or even know as a possibility for you to be if you haven't heard the subtypes. Because if you just hear about the way the 9 types tend to be talked about, they don't really include some of these subtypes. So it's really important to know that. It also explains why 2 people of one Enneagram type can look quite different. And sometimes people think it's because of wings. So wings are simply the type on either side of the type. So if you're an 8, your wings are 9 and 7. If you're a 3, your wings are 2 and 4. And wings do flavor the main type because that circle is a spectrum. It's not so much discrete points along the circle, it's a spectrum. But the thing about it is they're just flavorings, and they shift depending on your history or biography. And there's one of the most popular books about the Enneagram, The Wisdom of the Enneagram, came out in 1999, talked about wings as subtypes, right? We think that was a big mistake. But because Riso and Hudson are so popular, a lot of people think whatever they say is gospel. And so a lot of people have followed some aspects of Enneagram theory that we actually disagree with. But it's not like it's an academic field. It's not like there have been a lot of people out there saying they're wrong. And if you say they're wrong, you get a lot of pushback because everyone loves them so much. So Uranio and I are a little bit like saying, okay, we did actually a podcast called Wings Aren't Subtypes. And part of what we want to do is say, people, when they go to wings, it's like they're over-determining something that doesn't really exist. And the truth about wings is they're growth opportunities, they're growth stretches. So as a 2, I can stretch into 3 and stretch into 1 to sort of broaden my perspective, to grow out of my fixated perspective as a 2. And I can do it in different times, in different ways, very consciously, in different situations where, it would actually be good for me to do some of the things a healthy 3 would do right now, because I'm too stuck in my 2 perspective. So subtypes are based on instinct. Instinctual subtypes are what we think these 3 versions of each type are really important to know. So for each of the 9 types, there are 3 subtypes based on which one of 3 instincts is dominant. So in the body center, our instinctual center, all of us have, and it's connected to the reptilian brain, 3 core instincts. An instinct for self-preservation, an instinct where it's like kind of about me, like, okay, my field of vision is me right now. Am I okay? You know, do I have enough resources? Do I have enough structure? Am I safe? Am I okay? It's very me-focused. You know, the social instinct is the instinct that's about the group or the community or the family. And it's more a person who survives through the connection to the collective. Now, it's not always someone who feels comfortable in a group, right? But in some of the cognitive functions, I heard, ooh, that's a person who has high in social instinct probably. So I think there are some correlations not only with type, but also with instinct. So the social instinct is sort of like you don't survive without the tribe. And by the way, this aspect of our personality is what we share with animals. So when we do workshops, we'll show animal videos to teach about the instinct. So birds, like a murmuration of starlings. How do they know to all fly together? You know, schools of fish that survive and away from predators by swimming completely together. How do they know to do that? That's the social instinct. And then the sexual instinct, I call it one-to-one when I'm in a business setting for obvious reasons. But the sexual instinct is not just about sex. It's more about fusion or merger, but it's also about creativity, and it's about rivalry. So sexual dominants tend to be more competitive, right? And so one of the things we do is we show 3 pieces of video from that movie, March of the Penguins. And there's a great scene where it's mating season, and the penguins are fighting with each other over the mate, right? So it's the instinct of I've got to find that a one-to-one bond with that other person that supports survival and feeling safe in the world, and so it's about generativity. It's about rivalry and competition. It's about showing off the colors in my feathers as a way of drawing attention. So each of those instincts is again, we have all 3 in all of us, but just like we each overuse one of the 3 centers, we each overdo one of the 3 instincts. And then there's one that's kind of in the second place, and then there's one that's in third place, which we often call repressed, because that third one is sort of not there at all. And that has a big impact on your personality. So if you're self-preservation repressed, you have people that actually put themselves in danger, right? So Uranio is self-preservation repressed. I'm self-preservation dominant. So a lot of our difficulties and challenges in working together comes from that, even more, or maybe at the same amount as him being a 5 and me being a 2. But as a self-preservation repressed, like he does things like he forgets I can't tell you how many times he's forgotten his iPhone in an Uber. He's always leaving. One time he left for the airport without one of his suitcases. It's like it's like a lack of attention to self-care. And there's even, and again, these things go really deep. There's always a dark side to everything. Even a suicidal tendency in people who are self-pres repressed. It can even go there. In self-preservation dominance, it's a lot about like for me, it's like, all right, when's my next meal and where am I going to eat? And, like when I go on a trip, okay, I have to have everything planned. And, how am I going to get from the airport to the hotel? And how do I have everything lined up? And also structure. So when I do talks, I always need to have an outline. Now, when I do the talk, I forget about the outline. That's probably the NE in me. But having the outline makes me feel more okay to kind of just talk extemporaneously. So for each of the 9 types, you have a dominant instinct. So there'll be a self-preservation 1, and a social 1, and a sexual 1. Self-preservation 2, social 2, sexual 2. So now you have 27 types. And each of those 3 types within one type is also very distinct from one another. And so, for instance, the self-preservation ones tend to be self-critical and critical of others. But the self-preservation one is much more critical of themselves than they are of others. And the sexual one is much more critical of other people than they are of themselves. The social one is kind of in the middle. So there's a lot more I could say about all these subtypes, but you kind of get the picture. And so one of the things that's interesting to know about is the instincts themselves. So knowing if you're a self-preservation or a social dominant. My Uranio is a social 5, so he's a social dominant. And I've learned a lot about social. Like he's really into politics. And like when we're going to do a retreat, I say, please don't read any news, because he can get really upset about what's going on in the world. He's from Brazil, he lives in London, and Brazil is having a really hard time, and so he can be very affected by that. He has a big sense of cultural identity. He has a big sense of like wanting to help the world. So these instincts are very powerful in shaping the way the type gets expressed. And for instance, there are types that if you are that subtype, if you read a lot of Enneagram books, you won't relate to your type. For instance, self-preservation 3 and sexual 3, most books are written about the social 3. And so sometimes self-preservation 3s think they're 1s because self-preservation 3 looks a lot like a 1, but it's a 3. But because some of the books don't have that nuance, people can read about 3 and go, well, that's not me. You know, I'm not always seeking recognition. The social 3 is. The self-preservation 3 wants recognition, but sort of also shy about it. Doesn't want to brag. They want to be good, like 1s do. But the difference between 1s and 3s is 1s have an inner standard of what good is or what right is. And 3s go by the external consensus, like what's right or good as decided by social consensus. So it's external referencing versus internal. The only other thing that I haven't said that, thank you for mentioning it, so I can say it now, is if there's a dominant instinct, like let's say I'm a self-preservation 2. My next instinct is social and my repressed is sexual. I have a good friend who's a self-preservation 2. Her next instinct is sexual and her repressed is social. So if you count instinctual sequence, or stack, it's sometimes called stack, we call it sequence, then there are 6 types of each type, which would mean 54. So if you think of it that way, it's because there are 2 kinds of self-pres, 7s, 2 kinds of social 7s, 2 kinds of sexual 7s, depending on what's second in that and what's third. And so if you think about the instinctual sequence, you could say there are 54, because we see nuances in that. For instance, there's 4s and 6s are the 2 types where the subtypes are the most different from one another. Like the 3 4s look completely different. The 3 6s and the 3 6s, there's like fight and, we all know there's fight or flight, right? There's 1 6, that's the fight 6. There's 1 6, that's the flight 6. And then there's a third 6, that's a kind of get protection from an authority 6. So there's fight, flight, and get protection. And so those 3 6s look quite different. And so if you think about having a flight 6, the 6 that kind of wants to run away and hide and just be really nice to everyone so they don't get attacked, and the 6 that's like ready to fight when they get afraid, like if you have that self-pres first and then the sexual second, you've got a fearful 6, but that every once in a while can get angry and sort of get rebellious and contrarian. So that's different than a self-pres 6 that has social second, and the social is much more intellectual and rules-based. So let me stop there. I know I've said a lot, and just see if you have questions or comments. Mm-hmm. A great question if someone's choosing between 2 types and they aren't sure which one it is. So I recommend using multi-methods, and you can find a professional to do a typing interview. We call it a typing interview. It's a profiling thing. In the back of, one of my books is called The Complete Enneagram, and in the back there's an appendix. And the appendix has similarities and differences between every pair of types. So if you wanted to look at that, you could see, like, okay, I can't decide if I'm a 1 or a 3. So I'll look at that section. It'll say 1s and 3s are similar in these ways, but they're different in these ways. That might be one thing. Another thing is it's important to know that I think I'm maybe unlike the Myers-Briggs, but there are a lot of Enneagram tests you can find online, and a lot of them are really bad. Most of them are bad. So if you do take a test, don't trust it completely. Take it as one piece of data. But sometimes you can take a few different tests. Some tests are free. Some tests cost like between $10 and $15. The best test out there costs $50, unfortunately. You do get a report. We're developing a test. We have a micro test on our website that's free if you give us your email address. But if you do take a test, again, don't give over your authority to the test to say what you are. Validate it, And another good thing to do is sort of multiple methods, so different tests, talking to maybe an expert in the Enneagram, although be careful about that, because when I have time, I like to do typing interviews, and I've been doing a lot of them this year, and a lot of times what I hear from people is, an Enneagram coach, at the end of the interview, I think, well, my hypothesis, and I always phrase it a hypothesis, my hypothesis is that you're a 4, and here's why. A lot of the way these guys are teaching the profiling, the verification process and the explanation and the tying it to what they said, and I do the same thing. I take down phrase and said, when you said this, that. So after I do that, what people have sometimes, I talked to an Enneagram coach and they told me I couldn't be a 4 because 4s are always impatient and I'm not impatient. And I'm like, that's crazy. Like, that's not, that variable, 4s could go either way. So I think there are sort of some mistakes out there and some people who think they're experts. So always take it with a grain of salt and validate it yourself. Sometimes it's good when you're getting close to ask people who know you really well, and show them the 2 descriptions and say, which one do you see as more like me? For instance, there was a 9 in one of our recent courses, and she said that she had read that 9s avoid conflict. And she said, I don't avoid conflict. And she was talking about it with her partner. She said, look, this says I avoid conflict. I don't avoid conflict. He said, you totally avoid conflict. Are you kidding? So sometimes we don't see ourselves very clearly and we need help. So I'd use multiple methods. And check out the appendix in the complete Enneagram, because I've had people. I was doing a team session once, and this guy couldn't decide if he was a 3 or a 7, and I gave him that appendix in the book, and he looked at it, and a minute later, I'm a 7. So not that it will miraculously clear things up, but it might give you a place to start. Thank you for indulging me. Thanks, Antonia and Joel, for inviting me.
Give her a hand for coming up to the chair. All right, so that was Dr. Beatrice Chestnut on the main stage at our Profiler training event in Orlando, Florida. She's doing some speculation in this talk. She's talking about the Myers-Briggs stuff that she's learning, and she's starting to make patterns. And I was excited about that. I thought it was really great that she took to combining the systems, in her mind and playing with it in a very playful way. And I want us to do more of that here at Personality Hacker as we go forward, because we're looking for the growth opportunities in these both systems, conjoined.
Well, and I think we had a conversation with Beatrice before that ended up as a podcast a while back. I think right after the event actually happened. And we discussed how the familiar feeling of some of these functions and some of the Enneagram types could actually lead to mistypes. If you feel a sense of familiarity with one element of one of these systems, we sometimes think that it has to be a direct translation to the other system, but you can have a little bit of these flavorings in multiple systems, and that's what makes you a unique individual, is that you can have you can be as Beatrice mentioned, 4, Enneagram 4 sounds a little bit like introverted feeling. Well, what if you are a 4 and you aren't an FP in the Myers-Briggs system? Well, then that's going to color it a little bit. So it's nice to be able to see some of these things that resemble each other called out loud and then reevaluated after it's called out loud. So anyway, the whole point of this is just to get more familiar with these 2 systems and how they pair with each other, particularly for development and growth. And as we continue on in these series and talk a little bit more about the Enneagram as a growth tool, we are also going to, of course, encourage you to go check out the Enneagram Starter Kits. Those are now available, and we're super excited about that. So go to personalityhacker.com, and under our product catalog, you'll see the suite of programs that we have available, and the Enneagram Starter Kits are one of them. So go check those out, find your Enneagram type, and invest in yourself and your growth process by going down the road of the Enneagram as a tool for personal development and growth.
These are fantastic starter kits, and I think they impact people in deep ways. So I want to just echo what Antonia said. Go check those out, learn about them. I think it would be a great investment in yourself to take action, to go ahead and get the starter kit for your type. Tell us how it works for you. We'd love to hear your feedback. So what did you think about Beatrice's talk and about how she explained the Enneagram? Did it make sense? What are some questions you still have? What are ways the Enneagram has impacted your life? Like, how has this shown up for you? We'd love to hear from you. Head over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, you can leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your personal story. You might have had an Enneagram awakening in your life, something that really spoke to you, where you grew and you changed and you developed yourself. We want to hear about that. What was that like for you? What was that journey like? Maybe you're in the middle of it. What's the struggle like? We want to hear what your story is. So come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. We've got a book. It's called Personality Hacker. It's available at all major book retailers. And if you leave a rating and review for us on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. Go check out our suite of programs at personalityhacker.com. There are programs that are personal growth oriented through the lens of personality type. And of course, you can get on our mailing list as well there and be aware or made aware of all the exciting, cool things that are coming up.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning. We are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.